schedule here. The next talk is by David Brown, who's Department of Biological Sciences, Eastern Kentucky University, and he did this work with Tom Sherry at Tulane University. And the title of the talk is Hurricane Katrina Impacts on Breeding Bird Community in a Bottomland Hardwood Forest of the Pearl River Basin, Louisiana. David's giving the talk.
All right, thank you, Joe. Thanks for the invitation to the seminar, and thanks for all of y'all out there in virtual world that are joining in. So I actually want to start with a little walk down memory lane, and I'll tie this into the symposium and the theme of hurricanes. But it turns out that Tom Sherry, who's my co-author and who was my PhD advisor, he helped organize, in addition to this conference, the third NAOC that happened in 2002 in New Orleans. And during that conference, which happened at kind of this confluence of technology, kind of like this, where we're all doing this virtually, we had to have traditional slide projectors and PowerPoints in every room, and so it was chaotic and difficult. But we also had a hurricane that turned into a tropical storm that made landfall in the middle of the conference and dumped 15 inches of rain in the conference, but made for some great birding, and we all managed to get down to the House of Blues for a fun, rollicking night, one of those during one of the socials. So that's one of the things that we're really missing out on this type of virtual conference. But maybe everybody should go out and have their own little socially distanced solo party tonight. Okay, so Tom and I did this work in 2006 through 2008. Hurricane Katrina made landfall in 2005, and it was a Category 5 storm at its peak, and it became about a Category 3 storm when it made landfall. It is still the most costly hurricane economically on record. 1,800 people died, millions were left homeless. And so we are interested in the bird community response after the hurricane. And so we had been conducting surveys at a site for a few years, and so we followed that up after the hurricane. So this talk fits into the theme of the symposium because it really focuses on how birds respond to changes in vegetation that are caused by the hurricane. So the opening of the canopy and the changes in the understory growth as well. So our study area is the Pearl River Basin in the Bogachita National Wildlife Refuge. It's right on the border with Mississippi. The eye wall of Hurricane Katrina passed directly over the study area and it completely defoliated all of the trees. And when we look at the change in the forest structure caused by the hurricane, we see that the canopy was really opened up. So before the hurricane, the canopy cover was around 90%. And then a year following the hurricane, after leaf out in that following year, it was only around 30%, and then it increased slightly over the next couple of years. Basal area was also really heavily reduced. If you look at the top picture, up on the top of that tree there on a ladder is Tom Sherry looking for an American redstart nest and maybe keeping his eye out for the next coming hurricane. Probably not a good place to be during a hurricane. So that opening of the canopy had strong effects on the understory as well. And so that increased light really led to an explosion of growth by woody stems and in particular blackberry. So what was before the hurricane a really open understory in this bottomland forest became a really thick understory. So also this to me was one of the most difficult kind of field conditions I had ever worked in. After working in Alaska and Montana and lots of other challenging places between the mosquitoes, the ticks, the snakes, But really walking through this thicket, any of y'all who've worked in hurricane ravaged areas understand that it can really be a challenge. So we predicted the changes in vegetation would affect the bird community in a few ways. One way was that the species that prefer a dense understory would increase. We also predicted that canopy preferring species and species that prefer a more open understory forest would decrease. And we expected stronger negative effects on the residents than the migrants because the hurricane occurred in late August and many of the migrants had already left or would soon leave, and the residents were subjected to kind of that long fall and winter of damaged habitat and defoliation. So we did this study using point counts. We had a single 45-hectare plot across, and we had 24 sites at that. We did 2 counts per year. We had 5 non-continuous years before the hurricane and then 3 years after it. Our analysis included some different measures of community change. Here I'm just going to present on the Shannon index values and kind of their related measurements. And then we looked at the most abundant species, the 17 most common species, and used distance analysis where we could model the probability of detection for before and after the hurricane. So we'll look first at the community change, and we saw that Shannon values went up slightly after the hurricane. Species richness increased by about 2.5 birds per site location after the hurricane, and then evenness was largely unchanged. So we didn't see any species disappear from the community, and in fact we had 2 species, yellow-breasted chat and eastern towhee, that were almost absent or completely absent before the hurricane that became more common after it. So we'll look now at some of the examples of the 17 species that we looked at more intensively. First off, the white-eyed vireo, which is an understory species that prefers dense thickets but occurs in forests, and it increased by about 2-fold after the hurricane and then maintained basically a constant density after that. Kentucky warbler is another species that prefers a thick understory, usually in a forest setting, but not an open understory for sure. And they increased almost 4-fold following the hurricane and also maintained that relatively high density for the several years that we were able to monitor them. A yellow-breasted chat is a species that prefers thickets and scrubs, and you don't really typically associate it with a forest. So the fact that it increased from almost being absent to having densities of about 1 per 3 hectares, that really reflects the size and the degree that the forest openings that occurred caused by the storm. So you can notice also that they tended to decrease in those few years following the storm after that initial peak. So one species, Acadian flycatcher, had a negative response, and they're a mid-story species. They prefer an open understory. They tend to avoid disturbed and fragmented forests, and their density declined following the hurricane. So let's look at kind of all of those 17 focal species together. In this table, we see it's organized by what the direction of the density response by species, whether it's positive, neutral, or negative, and it's separated the migrants and residents into kind of 2 different guilds. So the positive responses all follow our predictions that understory birds, in particular migrants, would respond favorably and increase in density following the opened canopy and the thick understory. The Acadian flycatcher, as I mentioned before, was the only species with a significant negative response. And then a whole bunch of species had no obvious response, no detectable response. And most of those are canopy species or mid-story species, or use multiple strata with the exception of the cardinal. So it looks like the residents and the canopy birds were relatively resistant. And so if we put this in the context of the theme of the symposium, and we look back to this figure by Zimmerman that Joe Wonderly showed in the introductory presentation yesterday, the positive responding understory birds really follow that pattern shown in line B of this figure. Most of the birds didn't really show any response, which is kind of the ultimate level of resistance, I guess. But we don't really know about resilience, and I'm not sure how resilience fits into positively responding birds, but I guess they would still be resilient for them to bounce back down to those baseline levels. So just to summarize, the resident and canopy birds appeared resistant to disturbance. The understory birds responded favorably. We don't really, there were some differences between migrants and residents but we didn't really see a strong negative response by residents. We still don't know much about that. We don't know anything about the demographic processes behind these changes. We don't know if these changes have persisted. We'd intended to get back out there this year in the wake of using this symposium as kind of an opportunity to resample, but obviously that wasn't able to happen. And we also don't really know how the vegetation has changed since then, and especially in terms of invasive species, which we expected to really increase. So with that, I think I have some time, and Tom is probably not very happy with me for pulling out some old stories.
Well, thank you very much, David. I'm looking for questions here. Nice presentation. One of the things I like about your results are the implications for our Caribbean forests in the prediction that understory species may very well benefit. That is, the shrubby, matorral in Spanish types of species may benefit with a higher incidence of hurricanes. I think one of the differences between the continent and in the Caribbean is the degree of ecological release in the bird populations on the islands for a number of reasons, but since they're habitat generalists, we may not see as marked an effect as you see in continental forests. You're welcome to comment on that.
Well, I would just say it probably really depends on the specific type of habitat. So this was a bottomland hardwood forest that, it was a wetland, and so the undergrowth, given some light, is really going to explode because it's got the moisture and the nutrients. So I would expect, and then again, the impact of invasive species, at least in Kentucky and in Louisiana, some of the most important invasive plants are shrubs, the ones that have kind of the biggest impact on the habitat change, and especially in forested settings where they're preventing native trees from becoming established. And so I'm not sure how that plays in the Caribbean, but it's certainly something that should be an important factor in kind of the impacts of hurricanes throughout the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean, increasingly in future years. Is just the different impacts of invasive plants.
Mm-hmm. Good point. And it's a concern that's been raised in a number of places in the Caribbean, and Ethan alluded to it in his talk. So It is a good point. There's a question here. Is this an argument for the use of selective thinning in dense overstory bottomland hardwood forests?
Well, I guess it would depend what the goal is, and if there's particular species that might benefit. I mean, that's, if you look at, say, cerulean warbler, there's definitely arguments for doing carefully designed forestry, silviculture to benefit them. So I think it would depend on the goal. So I wouldn't argue for that broadly, but it does suggest that disturbance is, as we all know, an important factor in bird community composition. And so maybe we just need to understand that better. And hurricanes are for that.
Another question. Well, I noticed that
I'm out of time.
we're out of time.